Which is great, and we still have a lot of people coming. Today, Dr. Rose, who's assistant professor in the German department, will be speaking about Postmemory. And hopefully some of you have received the background reading, which is an optional background reading. But if not, I'm sure you'll hear about the subjects in that reading, as well as Professor Rose's talk. The talk's going to last for about 40 minutes, followed by discussion. And we hope, just as in last time, there'll be a sort of an active and interesting discussion to follow this. And Dr. Rose's biography, he went to Reed College, and well, he grew up partly in a castle, as we heard yesterday. And then, this is all from class history. And then he went to Reed College, he got his, then he moved on to University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD in both German or comparative literature, as well as critical theory. And now, this is your first year at UCW,
yes.
Sorry? Yes. We look forward to your talk. And if anyone wants coffee, just pass your cup this way.
Yeah, please don't be shy. But yeah, picture.
Professor Rose, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out, especially in the midst of end of quarter craziness. Thanks especially to Matt for the invitation to participate in this series. What I want to do today is to try to place the concept and practice of post-memory, as Marianne Hirsch has theorized it, in a wider context of developments in modern epistemologies. I hope that you had the chance to read the introduction to Hirsch's fairly recent book on post-memory that Matt circulated and I just mentioned. It's The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, but it's no problem if you didn't get a chance to do that. Some of the ideas I'll be presenting rehearse things that I've said in published articles, but the majority of this talk is unpublished work in progress, and indeed truly in progress, tentative, at times possibly a wee bit scattered, but hopefully also suggestive in various ways. Let me start by distinguishing post-memory from trauma. Many critics move rather seamlessly between discussions of trauma and post-memory. I see them as substantially distinct. Although post-memory and trauma share much as phenomena and as theoretical interventions, they rely upon and imagine quite different relationships to representation, referentiality, and the archive. If, in Kathy Caruth's phrase, history, quote, history like trauma is never simply one's own. History is precisely the way we are implicated in each other's traumas. The traumatic mode of transitivity by which we become implicated in the traumas of others operates on the basis of the collapse of representation. The transitivity implied in the very term post-memory, in contrast, functions on the basis of representational success, however limited or ambiguous. Because it is so proximate to, yet also fundamentally different from, the dynamics of the trauma paradigm, post-memory as a phenomenon and an ethical and critical practice can point toward ways of continuing an engagement with many of the central concerns of trauma theory, our responsibility vis-a-vis effaced others, and how to read their traces, the dangers of appropriation and of totalizing knowledge, among others, while also avoiding some of the theoretical dead ends and the egregious ethical implications for which trauma theory has been, in my opinion, rightly criticized. In this way, post-memory may offer a productive counterpoint to the ethics and critical practice based on the presumption of the collapse of representation that we find in trauma theory, as well as in more properly philosophical interventions by, among others, Maurice Blanchot, Jean-François Lyotard, and more recently, Giorgio Agamben. Much of this, what I would call anarchivic theory, as I've argued elsewhere, articulates itself and can only articulate itself by neatly foreclosing, discounting, and silencing the archive of traces that remain. In other words, and perforce all too briefly, I see this strain of post-Holocaust ethical thought, which takes as its cornerstone the imperative to bear witness to what could not and cannot be said, the différent in Lyotard, or the absent speech of the Musulman in Agamben. Although the ethics is to listen, right, to the wound or to the silence and so forth, it has the effect of discounting what can and has been said by victims of the Shoah as beside the point, as uninteresting, as banal. In effect, this form of attending to silence silences the victim's speech. It forecloses the Holocaust archive. In its limited and more or less clinical definition as a phenomenon that affects the descendants of Holocaust survivors, post-memory is a useful term for a range of cases that involve the intergenerational after-effects of traumatic experience, and for numerous works of autobiography, autofiction, fiction, and autobiographical criticism by second and subsequent generation Holocaust writers, and that are structured around such dynamics. Such as, among a great many others, Art Spiegelman, Georges Perec, Henri Razimov, and Marianne Hirsch herself. Outside a clinical or autobiographical context, however, the concept becomes rather problematic. Hirsch grants that people who are, quote, not themselves children of Holocaust survivors can, quote, nevertheless speak from the position of post-memory. While such an opening of the concept makes it more available as a, quote, space of remembrance and as a critical posture, it also positions post-memory between a descriptive or analytical term and an ethical imperative. One should identify with the victims. Moreover, widening the concept in this way raises multiple questions. When, how, and to what degree can scholars, artists, or anyone else choose to adopt the position of post-memory? And how are we to distinguish such a choice from the predicament of those who find themselves, in the term's more restricted definition, quote, dominated by narratives that precede their birth? So she makes a distinction in this new book, which is made before, which makes it a little bit more emphatically here, between familial post-memory and affiliative post-memory. But I find that distinction is one that maybe needs to be more rigorously theorized than I've seen. To distend the notion of post-memory too far entails the risk that it might become as inflated a term as trauma. Several critics have remarked on how the essential negativity at the core of trauma theory tends to level historical and subjective specificity. As Dominic LeCapra argues, trauma theory, specifically Shoshana Fellman's treatment of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, in this case, elides historical reality to the Lacanian real. I'm quoting LeCapra, and the result is an absolutization of trauma and of the limits of representation and understanding. Trauma becomes a universal whole in being, or an unnameable quote-unquote thing, and history is marginalized in the interest when history's small h is marginalized in the interest of history, capital H, as trauma indiscriminately writ large. What traces of traumatic experience signify in the final analysis is precisely what they are not and by definition cannot be: alterity, absence, excess. So when you read trauma and trauma theory, it's generally the spaces, the ruptures, the places where communication and language and representation break down. Right? That's the you read not for what is said, but what can't be said, and that's both, I think, ethically admirable and also problematic. Post-memory can readily be elided to traumatic memory because both are belated encounters with events one has not experienced oneself. Yet, I should back up and say, because in trauma, the theory is that the kind of sense in which traumatic experience is never fully experienced, right? And that's why it has to come back. And so it's kind of so the trauma itself is, in a certain sense, not experienced, and post-memory is the memory of someone else's experience, in a certain sense. So in that sense, they have a structural similarity with a difference. Yet post-memory's specific mode of historical exploration implicitly contests the epistemological and representational aporias axiomatic to trauma theory. Post-memory and trauma often produce strikingly similar effects because they mirror each other. Each inverts the other's relationship of interiority and exteriority. The traumatic kernel, the unconscious object of traumatic memory, constitutes an internal exteriority. If in Carruth's influential formulation, it is unclaimed experience, one that one carries within oneself as part of the internal exteriority of the unconscious archive, or what Derrida in Archive Fever calls a prosthesis of the inside. A black box that you have, sort of a suitcase that you can't open. You don't know what's in there, right? But it's new. Post-memory, in contrast, is a sort of exterior interiority. There is something out there beyond one's own experience that nonetheless seems uncannily intimate. Post-memory is not only, like all memory to some degree, mediated by, but in fact constituted in interpolation by objects, documents, narratives, meaningful silences, topographies, and paradigmatically, as Hirsch argues, by photographs. Post-memorial subjectivity forges unstable and irreducibly ambiguous relationships between self and other, a present and a past, an interiority and an exterior archive of traces into which it cannot not insert itself. If a failure of representation initiates dramatic subjectivity, post-memorial subjectivity fabricates itself in and through representations. The post-memorial archive is experienced as a realm of presences, no matter how fragile and fragmentary. And although what is arguably most present in the post-memorial archive is inevitably absence itself, post-memory works to return to absence a margin of specificity that trauma theory tends relentlessly to erode. For absence needn't be generalized, it too has its own facticity. If it is trauma's negation of representation and experiencing subjectivity that ensures that it can only, return, post-memory must be sustained by an active investment, a work of recovery. It requires, as Hirsch says, projection, investment, and creation, emphasis added. So, trauma returns, right? The return of the repressed, and you have a traumatic repetition. But if you don't sort of read things and work at it and sort of create the story actively and externally in a way, then you don't have the same phenomenon in post-memory. The post-memorial enterprise requires a peculiar sort of detective work, a complex labor of reconstruction that entails an often phantasmic relation to historical research, evidence, and the archive as an uncanny realm at once radically exterior and powerfully intrinsic to oneself. As the subject of post-memory engages with sites, artifacts, and narratives that mediate another's traumatic experience, she becomes involved in an ethically complex, delicate, and ambivalent game of, on the one hand, assimilating the traces of the author's trauma, and, on the other hand, resisting the temptation of appropriative identification. Moreover, in the creative activity of filling in a radically incomplete memory and discovering a secret not one's own, the post-memorial subject does not simply explore a given archive, for the archive is precisely never simply given. Its edges remain difficult to establish. The archive may be nowhere and is potentially anywhere. In what we could broadly call post-memorial literature, we frequently witness personae who search, interrogate, and experience sites, traces, and clues as though they were archives. Post-memorial archivization can at times deal less with the recording of memory traces than with perceiving or constituting certain places, narratives, and artifacts as virtual traces of one's post-memory. In this way, post-memory can discern an archive where none may actually exist. Post-memory, as an ethical and critical project, is then filled with very real risk. But at its best, it is intrinsically concerned with, it is to a great extent the concern with this very risk. A minute ago, I referred to post-memory as a kind of detective work, and I meant that as more than a passing reference. Indeed, I think that the most effective way, or maybe just the most fun way, to illuminate the specificity of post-memory and what is at stake in the implicit epistemological claims it makes is to think of it in terms of the evolution and of detection in modern epistemology and intellectual history. So now I'm going to shift gears and offer an overview, admittedly highly idiosyncratic overview, of detection in the modern Western episteme. I'll take a sip of coffee before I try to do that. The detective must be granted a place in any archetypology of Western modernity. A peripheral figure, to be sure, yet one whose enduring popularity owes much, I would argue, to the status of detective work, as both a basic structure and a privileged metaphor of modern inquiry. While one will certainly find modes of deductive reasoning in whichever historical period one may choose to examine, it is, in my view, a dubious undertaking to trace the origins of the modern detective back to ancient figures such as the diviner or that most tragic detective of all, Oedipus Rex. In his justly famous article, Clues, Morelli, Freud, and Sherlock Holmes, historian Carlo Ginzburg does just that. while Ginsberg's primary task is to trace the emergence of an epistemological paradigm of the late 19th century social sciences, in a word, the paradigm of detection, he nonetheless positions modern detective work in a relation of continuity with ancient, indeed mythic, practices. In an engaging and vertiginously erudite, almost say maniacally erudite excursus, Ginsberg follows the career of detection from its primal origins in the, quote, gesture which is the oldest, perhaps, of the intellectual history of the human race, the hunter crouched in the mud, examining a quarry's tracks. Through the Mesopotamian paradigm of divination, Hippocratic medicine, popular medieval and early modern conjectural lore, how to tell the health of horses from their hooves, how to predict a storm from shift in the wind, to the epistemic shift in the human sciences between the 18th and 19th centuries, from which the new medical semiotics emerged as a privileged conjectural model. Following the oddly similar genealogies of modernity in Georgi Lukács's theory of the novel and Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, we can better appreciate the fundamental modernity of the epistemology of detective work, I think. In The Order of Things, Foucault writes, I'm going to read out a longish quote, but I think it's pretty accessible actually. Up to the end of the 16th century, resemblance played a constructive role in the knowledge of Western culture. It was resemblance that largely guided exegesis and the interpretation of text. It was resemblance that organized the play of symbols, made possible knowledge of things visible and invisible, and controlled the art of representing them. The universe was folded in upon itself, the earth echoing the sky, faces seeing themselves reflected in the stars, and plants holding within their stems the secrets that were of use to man. Painting imitated space, and representation was posited as a form of repetition, the theater of life or the mirror of nature that was the claim made by all language, its manner of declaring its existence and of formulating its right of speech. The world Foucault describes was marvelous, but not mysterious in the modern sense. In this closed universe, signs imitate other signs in an endless game of reflection, correspondence, and mutual confirmation. Missing from this world are two ingredients that are essential to detective work in the modern sense: a worldly principle of causality and the introduction of a gap or deferral in the signifying process, a treacherous interval between signifier and signified that wrenches meaning from the closed reflective paradigm and launches the modern detective upon a hermeneutic pursuit. Thus, in his Lukács-inspired study, The Detective Novel, indeed it is a sort of theory of the detective novel, Siegfried Kracauer sees in the detective the allegorical figure of modern alienated man. His analytic quest to recuperate meaning is only necessitated by the Weberian process of disenchantment of the medieval world of immanent meaning. Krakauer's detectives use a purely secular, autonomous reason. Krakauer's detectives' use of purely secular, autonomous reason would be out of place in the closed game of signification and the divinely created and maintained natural and social order of the pre-modern world. The medieval detective is, in this sense, a kind of contradiction in terms. In contrast, consider how many distinctly modern disciplines can be described as a version of a detective narrative. Kant's critical epistemology definitively demolishes the traditional proofs of God's existence and sets out to discover who, if not the Almighty, done it. Why and how do I experience X as X? What are the limits of my knowledge? And above all, what sense can I make of the world? Darwin, surely, is also one of the greatest of all detectives. Moreover, as Foucault and others have argued, modern medicine emerged out of a shift away from the static taxonomy of the classical nosographical table to a temporalized semiotics of symptoms. Likewise, the modern historian attempts to discern meaningful patterns from concrete cases or clues. The genre of the crime story evolved historically beside journalism's concern with everyday life, its coverage of faits divers, and investigative reporters and detectives remained close relatives. Modern jurisprudence, as Ernst Bloch has shown, is also a crucial matrix out of which the epistemology of detection and the detective story have emerged. Bloch accounts for the relatively late appearance of the detective story as a literary genre with a simple and, I think, compelling observation that, quote, the depiction of the evidence-gathering work of the detective is no older than the evidentiary hearing itself. End quote. Tracing what he aptly calls a hermeneutics of suspicion, Paul Ricoeur underscores a gesture common to the modernist triumvirate of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, namely that of suspending consciousness. I'm sorry, that of suspecting consciousness. They don't suspend consciousness. They certainly suspect consciousness. Whereas Cartesian doubt, as Ricoeur points out, recognizes a possible chasm between the external world and consciousness. The cogito rules out the possibility of any disparity between consciousness and self. In different ways, the world might not be the way I see it, but what I see in me is certainly very closely aligned, right? And so in different ways, in contrast, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud all suspect consciousness itself and subject it to a hermeneutical analysis to reveal the deeper latent meanings that reside behind or beneath consciousness or false consciousness. As Kuhn Geldhoff has written, Marx in Das Kapital shows how commodity fetishism engenders an optical illusion and renders improbable, if not impossible, the critical unveiling of the true secret of the capitalist world. Marx is without a doubt one of the first detectives of European modernity. End quote. What appears to be objective necessities from Marx in effect of historically contingent forces of production. In his genealogy of modern European moral conscience, Nietzsche diagnoses moral values as effects of a more profound, if deformed, unhealthy will to power. And Freud's detective work is legendary. His case studies read like detective novels, as do his later mythic genealogies of modern civilization. Freud's working subtitle for his Moses and Monotheism, 1938, Ein historischer Roman, an historical novel, moreover, was meant to indicate its reliance on the kind of affinities it's reliance on the kind of psychological insight and deductive prowess perhaps more typical of, as he says, ein Detektivroman, a detective novel. Without question, however, his claims to diagnostic mastery are at their most hubristic in his psychopathology of everyday life, in which he makes the slightest and most banal gestures and slips, or sips, speak the language of the unconscious. As Ricoeur rightly points out, however, the false consciousness we encounter in Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, while it requires diagnostic acuity and theoretical elaboration, it does not finally leave our three maîtres à penser at an impasse. Rather, each has recourse to deeper levels of meaning, whether the unconscious, Freud, the will to power, Nietzsche, or productive forces, Marx. The mystery, if you will, of false consciousness is, for each figure of this modernist triad, finally solvable. We can already discern a trajectory of increasing moral and epistemological equivocality in the development of the detective genre as the master detective a la Sherlock Holmes of the classical detective story, who is seldom, if ever, at a loss to restore the logical, moral, and social order of a crime may have temporarily suspended, yields to the hard-boiled anti-heroes of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler in the 1920s and 1930s. In contrast to their heroic precursors, the latter are marginal and corruptible, far from affirming what Geldhoff aptly calls the moral Manichaeism of the classical detective genre. The sleuths of roman noir are intricately implicated, financially, morally, and often sexually, in the violence, lies, double-crossing, and death which define their milieu. So this excursus on detective work in Western modernity brings us to the question of what mutations occur in the detective genre and in critical pursuits sharing obvious affinities with detective work as these turn their attention to the industrial genocide of European Jewry, a crime so huge and unprecedented that it is often said to have thrown conventional juridical and epistemological categories into crisis and tested, in Saul Friedlander's phrase, the limits of representation. The paradigm of detection as a basic structure and privileged symbol of the pursuit of modern knowledge may throw considerable light on why so many intellectuals and artists have been drawn to the detective paradigm as a means of approaching and testing relationships to the Shoah and its aftermath. I'm thinking here of any number of novels and short stories, especially but not only by child Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors, including the French writers Didier Denix, Philippe Grimbert, Patrick Modiano, Georges Perec, and Andrei Razumov, the Nobel Prize-winning Hungarian novelist Imre Kertész, Ruth Kluger made an impassioned plug when she spoke here a few weeks ago. The Dutch writer Harry Mulisch, German and Austrian writers Jörg Becker, Doron Rabinowiczi, and Vege Sebald, and the British and American writers Robert Wilson and Rebecca Goldstein, among others. The trope of searching for traces, what German calls Spurensuche, is also prominent in key works of Holocaust cinema, like Alain René's Night and Fog and Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. What moral and epistemological positions do these detectives, broadly defined, take up vis-a-vis the Holocaust? This, I think, is a crucial question for understanding any approach to Holocaust representation and memory, including but not limited to postmemory. The ethical, epistemological, and historical specificity of postmemory and its entanglements with real and phantasmic archives emerges more clearly when looked at against the backdrop of a different orientation, aesthetic, ethical, and epistemological, that has been powerful in theorizations of the Holocaust, and that I would call